I'm educational justice coach Lindsay Lyons, and here on the Time for Teachership podcast, we learn how to inspire educational innovation for racial and gender justice, design curricula grounded in student voice, and build capacity for shared leadership. I'm a former teacher leader turned instructional coach. I'm striving to live a life full of learning, running, baking, traveling, and parenting because we can be rockstar educators and be full human beings. If you're a principal, assistant superintendent, curriculum director, instructional coach, or teacher who enjoys nerding out about co-created curriculum with students, I made this show for you. Here we go. Welcome to another episode of the Time for Teachership podcast. This is episode 254, and today we're talking about student background knowledge, particularly troubleshooting the concept of students having no or limited background knowledge. So I'm really passionate about this. I've talked about this before, but just want to kind of get into some examples of what you can offer students when the knowledge about a particular time period or group of people or individual historical event or person appear to be lacking. So let's get into it. For context, the struggle for a quote lack of background knowledge is ever present in particularly my social studies coaching. And I first want to validate it is a very challenging thing when we go in to teach something and we expect or anticipate students have prior knowledge of particular events, vocabulary, people in a historical time period that we're teaching. And then we realize they don't have that, and then we need to adjust. So validating the hard there. And also a gentle push, we can expand our concept of what background knowledge is and cue students to connect to concepts or themes or personal lived experiences, other forms of media in which they have seen similar things, experienced different events that maybe people in history have experienced in different ways, of course. And I think that Zaretta Hammond's work in the Learn to Learn skills that she has put out in her 2025 book, as well as the cognitive routines she talks about in that book, can help inform perhaps like a reusable slide or anchor chart, some sort of cue that students can use as tools in their own learning. They can use both inside the classroom and outside of the classroom so that teachers aren't always doing the scripted kind of heavy lifting for students, making those connections for them, filling the background knowledge gaps, but that students can access background knowledge that might be relevant and identify where the sticking points or areas for further inquiry are. This struggle, I want to name, impacts a lot of different pieces of social studies pedagogy, particularly inquiry-based pedagogy, question generation. Anytime we're analyzing or synthesizing all the learning that's happening, we're in student-led discourse and conversations about how to answer an essential question for a unit by putting all of these various learnings together. Like that lack of background knowledge, and I'm using air quotes there, is important. So let me front load one more kind of thing that's on my brain, and then let's get to some frameworks that can support connections to existing background knowledge. And that's Zaretta Hammond's Learn to Learn skills, specifically her skills 2 and 3. She lists 5 of them. So 2 and 3, kind of after you figure out what, the prompt or the question or the thing is that we need to engage with, we scan the hard drive, she says, right? This is step 2 of the Learn to Learn progression. Have we seen it before? Have we seen something similar? What's the opposite from what we're seeing, right? So we're scanning our hard drive. We're noticing if there's anything that looks familiar. Then in the next stage, number 3, chew and remix. How is this connected to what I already know, right? This is happening in a child's brain or in an adult's brain, really a learner's brain. Is there anything confusing? How can I make sense of this, right? That's the key piece that sticks out to me, is the sense making. How do I make sense of this? And how to make sense of it in terms of connecting to what I already know. And so specifically here, we could think about the 4 cognitive routines. Which one could I use here? And she lists those out. DSRP are the kind of 4 initials of that. So distinctions, systems, relationships, and perspectives. And we'll get into these a little further in the episode. But these are in my brain as I am thinking about this challenge of a quote lack of background knowledge. So here's what we might be able to offer some students. Frameworks such as funds of knowledge, which comes from Mall, Amanti, Neff, and Gonzalez, 1992. It's used a lot in Head Start programs. So I'll link to some things here in the show notes. But funds of knowledge is one that we could definitely use. And so kind of an adapted version of this, I would say, is inviting students whenever we are introducing a topic or a prompt for discussion or consideration. Prompting students, does this make you think of your kind of, imagine a slide with like a dot, 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 right? And then a list of things, ideally with a visual and then a short kind of name. So one could be home language, right? Does it make you think of something that maybe there's a word or a term or some experience that is kind of peppered with your home language that connects to this term you're now seeing in whatever the language of instruction is? Is there a family value or tradition that this could connect to? So in whatever you're engaging with content-wise, does this connect to something that you as a family believe in or discuss or have experience with in terms of a tradition that you live out, right? Does it connect to any experience, activity, identity set of your friends or your family members? Are there any jobs that your family members or family friends do that connect to what we're learning about, right? So just thinking about the things that kids know, even young kids, right? This is being used in Head Start. We're talking preschool, pre-K. Young kids are familiar with language used at home, with what they do with their families and friends, and who those family and friends are, the jobs they have, the identities they hold, right? And finally, for funds of knowledge, anything related to chores or caretaking. So again, students have rich lives outside of school. What are those things that they're engaged in at home? Might be chores, might be just interaction with siblings or other young children or older siblings, any kind of like meal prep that they do, right? There's so many things that they are bringing to the table. So if we are learning about ancient civilizations, hunting and gathering, right? Oh, well, I prepare lunch for myself. I can make a sandwich with access to, my cupboard and my fridge at home, right? And that's pretty easy to go to the fridge versus like going and getting a meal from like nature, right? So like there's something in there that we can connect to. And so again, we don't necessarily need to name the connections for kids. We want to think about what's the thing we can give them that acts as a tool for them to make that connection, and that the tool can then go with them to another classroom or content area or beyond the school environment to support learning and sense making more broadly. Now, that is the Funds of Knowledge framework. I do want to offer one other framework, which is the Cultural Wealth Model from Yoso, published in 2005. And again, we'll link to like a summary of this, but I have changed a little bit the language in slides that I've used with students, particularly young students, although I certainly think secondary schoolers could engage with the language of Yoso's original language and her forms of cultural capital. So here's what basically the premise is, right? Is like all forms of cultural capital are present in children, and we need an asset-based understanding of kind of bridging school to home connections and thinking about the things that children bring to the table, right? There's so many assets that we overlook or devalue because of the culture that we live in that is steeped in white supremacy or white dominance. And we think about how do we value what students are bringing to the table that sometimes you'll see in the language here might actually confront or directly resist that oppressive society and what society purports to value with this strength, right? So here, let me just read her things. The 6 forms of cultural capital, according to Yoso, are aspirational, linguistic, familial, social, navigational, and resistant. And so here's what this might translate to for like a prompt to cue students to connect to some social studies content in perhaps like 3rd grade appropriate language. So you might say, does this make you think of think of like a ... and then a list with like an image and a short title for each cultural capital aspect. Does this make you think of your hopes and dreams? your language, which could be interpreted in anything, right? Like language could be English, but just the way that I kind of code switch between different audiences. It could be home language as a distinctly different language. Spanish, Portuguese, Mandarin, whatever is the home language is spoken at home. Could it be related to your family and community, your friends, right? So again, some strong overlap here with funds of knowledge. And then I think the two, aside from hopes and dreams at the top, but the two last pieces of her cultural wealth model, I think are the distinguishing factors here as well. And I think it lends itself more to like social studies content that has a more critical lens, which is always what I gravitate to. But one that Yoso calls navigational, I would name kind of like or term figuring out rules and organizations, and have a little picture of like an institution, like a school or something. And I would explain this to students because when you're introducing this, you might need to explain a little bit. Some things don't need cues at all, right? Like friends and family, we got it, we understand. But figuring out rules and organizations or navigational capital, right? Thinking about how you have to figure out how to go into, whatever it is. Maybe it's a religious organization in the community. Maybe it's school. Maybe it's somewhere for older kids that you work or where your parents work, right? You have to figure out how to navigate and what like the unspoken and unspoken rules are in those systems to be able to get by, right? And to maybe succeed and thrive, maybe to just not get in trouble, right? Like there's so much navigating that kids do. And so you have figured out the rules, both things that were told to you, yes, but even harder and perhaps more importantly, things that weren't told to you explicitly. That is an asset. And so how do you see this happening when we look at historical societies and communities and people having to navigate the both unspoken and spoken rules, the fair and unfair rules, right? There's a lot there that students can draw on their own experience to connect to social studies content. And then the term that Yoso uses is resistance. You can totally use resistance. I don't know exactly what grade that might be for unfamiliar language for, but for young kids, you might just say like, naming and fighting against unfair things. I think you would be able to use that with a 3-year-old, right? So like when you recognize something is unfair and you say that's not fair, right? Or you fight against it, right? Whatever language you want to use, but that's a concept that certainly like 2 and 3-year-olds are grappling with. So it's a concept that many, many students are going to latch onto and be able to draw connections to social studies or historical content or current event content with. So again, I think these all prompt things that students have access to. They have this cultural capital as part of their lived experience. And they can connect, but they need the prompting to be like, that's valid, right? Like that is a valuable connection. You're figuring out rules in your local church, you navigating where your dad works and being present in that space where you're never even told what the rules are, but you kind of figure it out on your own. Like that is what other people are doing in history. And you could see the implications as we read about historical content. Or current event content. Where is that happening now in other settings, right? I think that's something that, again, our role is cueing and validating as opposed to filling like an empty vessel, right? Like the banking model from Frary is like, we're not necessarily needing to fill the background knowledge. Yes, we're going to teach them, terms that are relevant. Yes, we're going to teach them about things that have happened. But I would argue that one of the most important things about social studies and really analysis in any capacity is like, can you understand the big enduring conceptual themes that extend from setting to setting, from time point to time point across history? And those require some practice. Like to do that well, those require students to access and connect with their own lived experiences and background knowledge, connect across time periods, compare and contrast, right? All these big skills.
Hi, this is Leah popping in to share the free resource for this episode, the Generating Questions Resource Bank. You can find it at the blog post for this episode, www.lindsaybethlyons.com/blog/254. Now back to the show.
And so I encourage us to use whatever framework works for you. I'll also just quickly share that not knowing any of these frameworks when I was a teacher, I just use a simplified slide, just thinking about what connections I make. So I like to unearth or uncover my own processes sometimes
to figure out like, how did I get there? And then maybe this will help kids, right? And then go from there, but use that as a starting point. And so I just would put up a slide. Does this make you think of a story from your life, current events, some kind of media, like TV show, movie, song, video game? Like I would list a bunch of media places, or another form of media, like book, or another subject in school, kind of like school media, right? Like, does this connect to, if I'm teaching social studies, ELA, science, art, PE, like, what other place could you connect to? Math. So think about what works for you. You can take or leave pieces that work, leave pieces that don't, make it your own, and change the language or imagery, certainly. But I will link in the show notes and blog post for this episode a resource that has some of these that I'm describing, these slides you can just take and use, or you could adapt them. Now, I want to talk through, before we close, just an example of what this looks like or could be like in action. So recently was working with a bunch of teachers in Boston public schools, some elementary and middle and high school social studies teachers, and thinking about Zaretta Hammond's learn to learn skills and those cognitive routines, as well as this challenge of kind of quote unquote lack of background knowledge. And what did we come up with? We came up with a framework. We came up with a lot of stuff, but what I want to talk about now is a framework that invites students to generate questions with a little bit of cueing and structure to support students who may be struggling to ask a question about like a new topic, or were you learning this new unit? What questions do you have, right? And that's kind of all we've got is like a quick question or prompts or image, like a very short amount of information, small amount of information, I should say, and then go time, ask questions. So here's what they decided. They said, okay, so there's kind of two things happening. We want students to ask about some important social studies themes. So the content is important, but we also want students to do some like skill-based stuff, like some cognitive routines, as Zaretta Hammond would describe them, right? So again, that DSRP is what we're thinking about at this point. So we want students to think about distinctions, like comparing and contrasting. We want them to think about the systems, like part to whole, whole to part, right? Relationships, like how do things happen over time? Like what is the cause and effect relationship, for example? Or perspective, right? How is perspective important? Certainly very important in social studies. So that's DSRP, or the cognitive routines. So we want both social studies content themes, and we want the skills or the cognitive routines. And how do we invite students to do all of that? Well, they came up with a slide that's kind of like two halves. And so they were like, okay, so ask a question about, and then they gave a few examples, that, and then they gave a few examples of cognitive routines. So in the content themes, it'd be like, ask a question about, and here's imagine like the left side, people or land connections. This connects to NCSS, or the National Council for Social Studies themes, people, places, and environments. It is a very common theme seen in many social studies content areas in chapters in history, as well as it also connects to like First Nation concepts of well-being. So I can link to some of that, but people, land, connections is a content theme. Or you could ask a question about another content theme, people's hopes and dreams. Again, that's directly from cultural wealth, but it also is present in the National Social Studies Civic Ideals and Practices theme. Ask a question about community care practices. So this was kind of adapted from Yoso's cultural wealth, also funds of knowledge, right? We're thinking a lot about family and community, friend groups, but also this is present in First Nations concepts of well-being. And then the fourth one, that they decided to include in this framework is what people did or can do to better the world. So thinking about like a justice orientation, collective action, civic action thing, right? This is certainly present in the national theme for civic ideals and practices, but it's also present in Yoso's cultural wealth framework with resistance particularly. So again, the content themes, people, land, connections, people's hopes and dreams, community care practices, and what people did or can do to better the world. These are the big things that we're often talking about in a social studies environment, right? This particularly one that is angled towards like advancing justice and power with, right? I'm thinking about the Berkeley frameworks here. a criticality lens, thinking about Goldie Muhammad, right? This is all really important. Now, the cognitive routines side of this, right? So ask a question about one of those content areas. Is there a pitch that does one of these things? Connects to today. So you got like some systems there, like part to whole, whole to part. Like how does this all fit together in the arc of history? But it also connects to relationships, right? I would say like cause and effect, like what happens in the past affects what happens today. And also NCSS, their theme of time, continuity, and change. So definitely still connecting the content themes there. You could say, asking a question that compares or contrasts, so that we have distinctions, that considers cause and effect, so you have relationships there, or that uplifts identities. So inviting students to push back on or ask the question of whose stories or voices are missing. So again, we have that perspectives, or also I would say systems, like understanding systemic oppression, right? And how systems work to marginalize, I think is also present in there, depending on where students take the question or the analysis that follows. So again, we have a framework that BPS used to pull on social studies content themes from various frameworks and national standards, as well as inviting students to use a cognitive routine stemming from the work of that Zaretta Hammond highlights in the work of independent learners and kind of how they make sense of things when they chew and remix in her Learn to Learn skill series. So example question stems that come out of this could be, and I mean, this is a little high level, but we wanted to come up with something that was really meaty for an example. But like, if we ask a question about the people-land connections, and we do something about connecting to today for the cognitive routine, that might be, how might Indigenous peoples' connection to the land inform how we interact with land today? And that's the question. And that might be a question that students come up with in third grade when we're learning about Indigenous peoples in Massachusetts. That's the particular curriculum they were talking about and the unit they were talking about. And so they were like, that is something that would be really high level for a student to ask, but also is like very possible, even if they just asked part of that question, because this cues them to think about those things. So obviously we took this in a direction in the BPS work and thinking about this framework in a direction that is far from the background knowledge. Like we end up in a really analytical kind of heady space, but we get there by first thinking about that content knowledge. So again, we're thinking about that Zaretta Hammond progression. We're scanning the hard drive. Have I seen this before? Have I seen something similar? We are chewing and remixing. How is this new content connected to what I already know? How do I make sense of it? And which cognitive routines can I use, right? So as students are making sense of the new information, they're accessing background knowledge, what is familiar. They're using maybe one of those frameworks to do that. And then that's where they can start to make sense of things because they do have that affirmed background experience or connection to other media. They have experienced this before. They have valuable kind of knowledge and insight. So now we're going to apply a cognitive routine and we're going to elevate that into a critical question or a level of analysis that's going to truly level up the historical thinking skills and the analytical thinking skills in the class, whether we're generating questions, we are participating in student-led discourse, we are writing a claim evidence reasoning paragraph, whatever it is. So here is what I would advise if you're just getting started with this or background knowledge feels really hard. What I would do is I would pick a framework. So one of the ones that we did, either Funds of Knowledge or Cultural Wealth framework, or pick a piece of that framework and just invite students to make connections using that one cue. Does this make you think of, how you've learned to figure out roles in organizations, right? Whatever the cue is, right? Often, these connections can lead to very insightful analysis. And you can do this at any point in the unit. It could be just when you're starting, if you're inviting students to kind of access that background knowledge, like a typical KWL chart, like when you would do that, use that cue there. You could also use it at the very end of a unit or anywhere in the middle. But at the end of the unit, it might be like when we are we got really granular, we learned a bunch of facts in the social studies unit, and now we're trying to analyze and draw bigger kind of key ideas, maybe answering the essential question, and we're trying to connect likely to the present. That is where that lived experience of someone in the present could do that, right? You're going to tie it all together. You're going to expand through connections. You started by like entering the conversation and entering the social studies content with a connection through your background knowledge linkage. And now you're expanding it outwards in your analysis at the end, right? So you kind of start big, start broad, get narrow, get granular, and then you broaden out again for analysis. I think that's a very common kind of arc. Okay, and the number 2 option to get started, if that feels like, you know what, that's a lot to introduce a new framework to my students, fine. Note instead where the connections are already being made by students. So your students are probably doing this to some degree, or maybe they're just about to make them, like they get really close. Maybe they make some offhanded comment about how it's similar to something in their lives, but they're making it as a joke or something, right? Like whatever it is, share what you're noticing with students, and then what you can do, and this is so cool, co-create your own slide or physical on paper anchor chart with those connection cues, because then they'll be rooted in the student ideas, which lends even more validity to this concept and this tool, and something that they could actually use. They'll remember it better. Okay, that's what I have for you today. I will drop a link to the various frameworks in the show notes and blog post for the episode. We'll also drop that free resource on generating questions resource bank, which will have the slides for queuing background knowledge connections from those kind of 3 categories we shared today. All of this information is going to be at lindsayBethLyons.com/blog/254.
If you like this episode, I bet you'll be just as jazzed as I am about my coaching program for increasing student-led discussions in your school. Shane Safir and Jamila Dugan talk about a pedagogy of student voice in their book, Street Data. And they say students should be talking for 75% of class time. Do students in your school talk for 75% of each class period? I would love for you to walk into any classroom in your community and see this in action. If you're smiling to yourself as you listen right now, grab 20 minutes on my calendar to brainstorm how I can help you make this big dream a reality. I'll help you build a comprehensive plan, from full-day trainings and discussion protocols like Circle and Socratic Seminar to follow-up classroom visits where I can plan, witness, and debrief discussion-based lessons with your teachers. Sign up for a nerdy, no-strings-attached brainstorm call at lindsayBethLyons.com/contact. Until next time, leaders, think big, act brave, and be your best self.
This podcast is a proud member of the Teach Better Podcast Network. Better today, better tomorrow, and the podcast to get you there. Explore more podcasts at www.teachbetterpodcastnetwork.com. We'll see you on the next episode.